So, inspired by the visual and ontological reflections between the stars and spring water, Water Moves, this is us three, is a collective research project exploring the deep ecology of Wellsprings in Wales. It aims to explore existing historical, mythological and artistic studies surrounding these sites, drawing upon their catalogue of landscape imagery, poetry, folklore and the lived cosmologies of local communities to reveal and to engage with the deep ecology of the Wellsprings. So this presentation will share some of our ongoing research on Wellsprings as sites of continued cultural, social, spiritual and ecological significance. We've structured the talk in 3 sections in which we'll discuss our research journeys, exploring key research themes of the project. Using folklore as a framework, Margaux Crump will offer insight into the catalyst of this research and will consider the personhood of Wellsprings through her experience making well water portraits. Jake Eshelman will then share his research exploring the unseen ecologies of sacred springs and holy wells, with a particular focus on how research creation practices can generate new and complementary forms of knowledge making. He will consider the epistemological, ecological and cosmological implications of ingesting water from sacred springs and holy wells. And lastly, I, Dawn Collins, will outline the movement research I conducted at Wellsprings, offering perspectives on what such roles, such artistic practices can play for communities in exploring the lived ecologies of Wellspring sites through the lens of Water Moves' collaboration and contribution with the Laelston Village Well project. And there are some materials about the project here for you all to have a look at if you want to later. I will discuss the potential value and importance of engagement through the arts for human reflections, connections, and dances with unseen or seen, or in brackets, seen beings. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaux.
I am standing in the center of an underground cavern. The cool air is heavy with the scent of damp rocks, and I'm leaning over a dark pool filled with stars. Floating in the liquid sky, time dissolves, and I sink beyond. An old man sits by a fire in the center of an earthen mound. He is holding a clay bowl filled with the starry sky. He points to a hole in the top of the mound where the smoke drifts up into the night air. He tells me the star people are calling. I understand that I am the old man. Water Moves was born from a series of recurring dreams and visions of the night sky contained within bodies of water. It first came into form as a single artwork, As Above, So Below, which juxtaposes an image of the microbiology within a single drop of well water, with an accompanying image of the night sky taken directly above the well site. The visual similarities reveal a kinship between the stars above and the spring water that surfaces from deep below. The spirit of this project is found in the spirit of place. This initial artwork was made at Orkney Springs, a small cluster of well springs tucked away in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Curiously, after making these images, I learned that the name Shenandoah may derive from the Algonquin language and is said to mean daughter of the stars. According to one old story, there was a great lake hidden in these mountains. The indigenous people would camp near this lake, and on a clear night, the water below would seem to hold the stars from the sky above. They called this lake Shenandoah, daughter of the stars. One day, the lake burst open and all the water drained out, forming a great river and leaving behind a fertile valley. Like the legendary Shenandoah Lake, what began as my own project has since flowed outward, following meandering folklores and fragments of family history, to finally reform itself into a collective artistic research project deeply rooted in Wales. By crossing the Atlantic Ocean and embarking on a 2-month pilgrimage to over 50 Welsh well springs, I imagined that I was answering the call of the star people. But once in Wales, I couldn't see the stars at all. Over 60 days, I think we had 2 clear nights. So in relationship to place, my focus shifted to the water, particularly the water's face, and I began to make a series of well-water portraits. In the history of art, portraiture is reserved for the representation of a human person's face and upper body. The idea of personhood, with all its philosophical complexities, is inherent in the genre of portraiture and is not traditionally extended to anyone who's not human. So lurking beneath the surface of my poetic gesture to make portraits of water, there is a quietly radical reframing, reimagining, and remembering of bodies of water as living persons. This is not a novel idea. Folklore and traditional knowledge from around the world remind us that water is animate, and Wellspring folklore is no exception. Much of the folklore associated with Wellsprings is teleological. It tells the tale of how a well came to be. But there are also stories of mercurial wells that physically move, that punish, that reward, that have consciousness. These tales shed light on Wellspring sensitivities, providing a folkloric account that offers guidance on how to engage with the ecology of the spring site. While there are myriad ways to interact with Wellsprings, there are 3 main no-nos: well pollution, failed stewardship, and defilement. To consider this more deeply, I'll be sharing a selection of my well-water portraits as I recount folklore that embodies and expresses the sentience of these springs. We'll begin with pollution. In most cases, dead bodies, mud, or manure were tossed into the wells, offending the wellspring's sensibilities and contaminating the water for the community. As punishment, the wells withdrew their waters or became undrinkable. An especially instructive story was collected by Marie Trevelyan in Folklore and Folk Stories of Wales. There was once a spring known as the She-Well. The spring's source was a cavern that was home to a water ogre. The She-Well once ran away. Murderers lived on the banks of the nearby rivers. They never mowed the meadows nor stirred the fields, and human blood often tainted the waters. Because of this neglect, the She-Well mourned and lamented, and one day it suddenly receded into the hills. The murderers then found that the streams feeding their rivers were dry, and all the fish were gone. They humbly went to the cavern to see the ogre of the She-Well, who promised to return the waters if the men cultivated the fields, mowed the meadows, cleaned the well basin, and planted trees nearby. The second no-no is failed stewardship, which generally falls into 2 camps: people who cover a well when they aren't supposed to, and people who forget to cover a well when they are supposed to. Neither offense has a happy ending, but forgetting to cover the well is catastrophic. The water overflows, rivers swallow villages, great lakes are formed, and entire communities drown. In his seminal work, The Holy Wells of Wales, Francis Jones shares that a farmer once closed the wells at Trellick, and an old little man appeared at the edge of one well and informed him that, as punishment, no water would flow on his farm. The farmer reopened the wells, and the water was plentiful again. Similarly, Fanon Gierig was once closed by a man, but the result of this transgression was that a curse fell on him, and a malignant ulcer followed his descendants unto the 3rd generation. But a far worse fate befalls negligent guardians. In another tale told to Marie Trevelyan, there was once a walled spring near the mythic court of the giant Tegid Voel. Each night, a lid was placed over the well to ensure its waters were not disturbed by malevolent forces. But one night, someone forgot to close the lid, and the waters overflowed, destroying the town, which lies drowned at the bottom of what is now Llyn Tegid, which you might know is Lake Bala as well. Akin to pollution, but deserving a category all its own, defilement is probably the greatest transgression. A cautionary example is found in The Elucidation, an anonymous old French poem in the Arthurian tradition, wherein we learn of a time when the land was fertile and the wells were home to maidens who offered nourishment from golden bowls to all those who asked them reasonably. But one day, a king violated their hospitality. He raped one of the maidens, stole her from the well, and forced her to serve him in his castle. His men followed suit, raping the well maidens and carrying off their golden bowls. From then on, no maidens came forth from the wells to nourish the people. All the land went into decline and was so wasted that all the streams dried up and no tree ever bloomed there again. In these stories, wellsprings appear, shift, and disappear. They punish, help, and teach. Their folklore articulates a distinct understanding of their personhood and agency. Their dynamism is sometimes seen as an expression of the ever-changing whims, wiles, and wisdom of water spirits, white ladies, the Sidhe, Gina Loci, and other supernatural beings who animate the wells. In this way, wellsprings are slippery thresholds where humans may interact with the other world, for better or worse. Wellspring folklore speaks to this often invisible web of relationships, and importantly, establishes how to respectfully engage with an expanded wellspring ecology. Stories like these taught me how to interact with the wellsprings and informed my methodology. At each site before making portraits, I would greet the well and introduce myself and the project. I would ask for permission and would leave a drop of honey nearby as a gesture of gratitude. This process encouraged me to listen to each well, and as I honed my senses, I began to perceive that the wells were showing me how to make their portraits. They brought me closer and closer to their surface, rendering their portraits more and more abstract until I was imaging the merging of water, light, reflection, and movement. And as this work evolves and is exhibited far from the wellsprings themselves, I still find that the wells and their folklore continue to be my teachers. And now I will hand things over to Jake.
Hello everybody, this is part 2, Well-Beings, an Ecology of the Unseen. For my contribution to this research, I used photography to explore the ecology of sacred springs and holy wells. Put another way, I wanted to consider what spiritual ecologies might look like. So going into our fieldwork, I of course had an idea of what these images might be, a visual survey of plants, insects, fungi, animals who were present at these sites. But I was also interested in finding ways to include the invisible beings who are found in these locations. It's not always glamorous work. As you can see, I became increasingly invested in the creative, technical, and existential challenges of imaging beings who live beyond the bounds of our human perception, as well as those who are generally excluded by normative ecological criteria. And it's within this Venn diagram where we might find mythological figures, the Sidhe, spirits of place, microorganisms, and so on. And more on them in a bit. I should first mention that there are many challenges with this sort of visual research. One of them is the fact that not all springs are necessarily sacred. One could easily argue that there are plenty of profane holes in the ground with water gushing out of them. So how do you tell which wells are spiritually charged, and in that case relevant to our research? So to solve this problem, we turn to folklore as our North Star. As you know, Wales is rich with stories of people's various encounters with otherworldly beings, spirits, and energies who frequent sacred spaces. And this is especially the case surrounding sacred springs and holy wells. So we use folklore as a roadmap to guide our research. We comb through local stories to identify specific springs and wells that are notable for their sacred ecologies, which is to say occurrences of miraculous healings, transfiguration, animal divination, fairy encounters, and so on. And from there, we created a map of these locations throughout Wales where we could successfully carry out the scope of our research. And once we had identified our sites, I just had to figure out how to image the invisible. So as an image maker, why on earth would I do this to myself? Simply put, because photography can be a particularly useful research methodology for ecologists and ethnographers, given its innate capacity to reveal, or at very least direct our attention towards, what we may not otherwise see. Through image making, we can observe relationships, interactions, and expressions of belief systems or cosmologies. And in addition, photography also provides us with the technology to reveal what would otherwise remain invisible to the naked human eye, which in turn enables us to understand the world around and within us in deeper and more intimate ways. This expansive perspective shift was particularly evident when photography first emerged as both a technology and as a practice. As Peter Greimer puts it, the early reception of photography and its visualization techniques sharpened awareness to the fact that things might be very different from how the senses perceived them. The camera certainly saw them differently. On the most fundamental level, the mechanisms underlying the photographic process enable us to experience the world beyond our biological and sensory limitations. Take, for example, the first medical X-ray image seen here, which provided us with an unprecedented view into our own physiology, and I would add our permeability. The same holds true for other photographic mechanisms, including long-term exposures, macro lenses, hyperspectral imaging, and so on, which each empower us to see beyond the physical and temporal limits of human vision. And here's another useful example where we're looking at the same plums through two types of imaging technologies. On the left, we have the RGB spectrum, which is essentially what the human eye can see. On the right hand, we see the same bunch of plums, but through hyperspectral imaging, which visualizes light waves well beyond what our eyes can process. With this additional information, we can now see the presence of mold bits, which are indicated in green, and plastic residues indicated in blue, that we'd otherwise miss. So as you can see from these just few examples, the photographic process itself offers new ways of visualizing otherwise familiar surroundings. And that provides us with both the opportunity and the responsibility for us to interact with a vibrant, dynamic world outside of our everyday experiences and assumptions. And this is how we change worldviews, including our own. So to quickly summarize, it's no stretch to suggest that photography offers us a lens into other worlds, and perhaps even into the other world itself. Now that we've established the utility of this research, I'd like to share a glimpse, if the other world will allow me, into my work exploring the ecology of the unseen at these sacred springs in Holy Wells. As a quick spoiler, folkloric beings are indeed quite difficult to photograph. I was only able to successfully image the presence of folkloric and mythological beings at these sites as they manifested in material culture, which is to say specifically through the idols or votive offerings that were made at these Wellsprings. So St. Winifred's Well is perhaps one of the best known holy wells and most popular pilgrimage sites in Wales. It's said to have sprung up from the spot where St. Beno brought his niece Winifred back to life. And as such, the well is thought to bestow miraculous healing onto those who bathe in or drink the water. As you can see, this gentleman here on the left is drinking the holy well water for healing and general health, as he told us. And it's also worth pointing out that he and his wife travel here at least once a year, specifically for this purpose. While St. Winifred's Well is now primarily associated with the church, it and many other sites also have a rich pagan history and undercurrent. This is especially evident in Ffynnon Sant Dyfnog in Derbyshire, where you can find this carving, who invokes a tree or forest spirit loosely reminiscent of Greenman. In context, this bust serves as a centerpiece, an idol, or even an altar in a gathering circle that was consecrated alongside the wellspring. And I also love and want to call attention to the hyper-locality of this figure, who, as you can see in the engraving on the right, was made from a sycamore tree that fell during a storm merely 20 yards away from the circle. So I'm only showing these couple examples for now, but suffice it to say that these beings remain elusive, and perhaps even camera shy, at least within the visual spectrum of my equipment. But there are other invisible beings who we did see. We simply had to explore the wells from a different perspective. And as you can see, some of us dove in face first, especially our intrepid research assistant, Jacob Blewett, who's pictured here. But what I'm really referring to, of course, are the myriad microorganisms that writhe and wriggle within each individual drop of sacred spring water. This is the reason that we lugged around a microscope throughout our field work, so we could consider these sacred ecologies on a microscopic scale. And on this level, we reveal an interesting possibility where folklore and science might enrich one another. What if the folkloric tales of invisible beings and other realms found at sacred springs referred to the microbiology in each site? What if the healing or divinatory properties of sacred spring water had something to do with the countless microorganisms who inhabit them? on a biological level, an esoteric level, or both? With this possibility in mind, here are some of the images of the beings and the worlds that we encounter. I will state openly that I'm not a microbiologist, so I currently only have a bit of information about these particular beasties. That said, I do understand something about the influence that microorganisms have on human beings. As noted in Effects of Regulating Intestinal Microbiota and Anxiety Symptoms, clinical researchers studying the gut-brain axis, or the relationship between our digestive system and our cognition, have discovered that the microorganisms in our gut directly influence how, and therefore what, we think. In other words, our thoughts aren't only our own. Rather, thinking is a collaborative ecological process. It then follows that ingesting sacred spring water may be a literal communion, an act the New American Oxford Dictionary defines as the sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially when this occurs on a mental or spiritual level. As you can see from these images, holy well water is teeming with life, and for me this begs several questions. Do these microorganisms contribute to the water's holiness? Are they a part of the sacred terroir of these Wellspring sites? When we drink the water and ingest these beings as a form of communion, do they impart some holiness unto us? Next slide, please. If so, does this holiness live on in us? And for how long? And finally, how might such intimate interactions with these sacred sites affect how we see, understand, and navigate our world? For me, the simultaneous beauty and horror of ethnography stems from the fact that a single inquiry leads to few answers and countless other questions. And this, of course, characterizes my experience with this specific body of research. So now, just shy of a year from our initial fieldwork, this research creation project is continuing to evolve and take shape. And ultimately, my goal is that our fieldwork, the resulting images, community-oriented site activations, and so on, can help us collectively understand more about what, or perhaps who, makes these sites sacred. Is it the water itself, the plants, insects, and animals we encounter, the humans who visit and maintain these sites, the folkloric beings who watch over these spaces through myth and story, the countless microorganisms making their way through the well water, or perhaps, more likely, a dynamic and largely unseen ecology connecting us all. Thank you, and with that I will turn it over to Don.
So part 3, Water Moves, Dancing Workshops and Dancing Wellsprings. For my contribution to this research, I used movement to explore the ecology of wellsprings, connecting and communicating with unseen beings through the language of dance. As Margaux expressed earlier, the spirit of this project is found in the spirit of place. And taking this, I aim to connect the spirit of place, to connect with it through the language of dance. This is a tongue I'm very familiar with, having practiced and trained and danced professionally previously. Movement can express things that don't translate easily into words. It communicates in a language that could be called universal. As we heard in earlier talks today, talking about symbolism, sometimes beyond words we have, visual images, we have things like this that can come forth with some sort of communication that we will never be able to exactly pinpoint in words, and the same could be said for other art forms. So here I wanted to connect and understand the field site, in this case the field site being the Wellsprings. And here the concept of field in fieldwork I understood as the world around and within us. So this image shows a moment during the offering of a homage with which I entered into each dance at the Wellspring sites. This act of meditative surrender with movement was accompanied by a votive and was intended as the opening to a conversation with the Wellspring beings. Dance artists whose practices resonate for me in this, inspiring and influencing my approach to the Wellspring sites, and the creation of a score for them, and the way I thought about this work and the methodology, include 2 in particular. So Jo Fong, pictured here, riding that horse. So she's an artist who puts ideas around forming and belonging to community through a project she called Ways of Being, which involved gathering large amounts of people together and moving and dancing together as a sort of community. And she found methodologies and ways through dance methodologies to actually, through workshopping, get those people, some of whom were strangers, some of whom not, to connect with each other and to move with each other and to find a common language through their movement. Her recent work, this one here, called The Rest of Our Lives, has a trigger warning which says that to the audience when they arrive that there may be moments of middle-agedness. So that sort of, for me, exemplifies the playfulness with which she approaches her work. And I wanted to bring that spirit of play here. Jo's creative process, something I find incredibly rich and central to this for me, is her exceptional capacity for acceptance and inclusion. And you can see here, this person here leaping through what is a performance, this performance space. You can see the so-called audience around the outside, but at certain points, all of these audience were involved. At one point, playing ping pong, so you can see the ping pong balls on the floor, playing ping pong across the space while movers moved. And in the end, the boundaries between who's performing and who's not a blur, and the group becomes a community to the extent that in one performance that I was also involved in, called How Should We Be, it's called Ways of Being, the whole audience had a dinner together on this in the performance space at the end, and the performers went and served them with the dinner. So this person here isn't designated as a performer. She's actually sitting up the back here. She's my daughter. So you can see how people sort of amalgamate into the spectacle, and actually if you saw this picture you'd think she was supposed to be there, you'd think she was part of, because that's how Jo's work creates a space that gives people such a sense of belonging, inclusion, and such a feel of community, even within a short performance time, that they feel like they can be totally part of it, and they look like they are part of it, and in fact they are. So this is what Jo says about this project called How Shall We Begin Again, which is the last project I did with her. And that project involved 50 performers, all performing for 15 minutes, their takes on how do we begin again after the COVID lockdowns and the isolation. And it was about that sort of, answer to that question. For each of those individuals, it was something different. And we had all sorts of people. And so the performance was like an installation in which the audience, so-called, came in and out and sometimes arrived. So yes, on its simplest level, it's about how we reconnect with ourselves, our bodies, and each other, she says. But this is the part that I felt very pertinent to what I was doing with Jake and Margaux here, that this kind of space, how do you hold this space between portraiture, protest, and something like a prayer? So this is the other performer, Rachel Lopez de la Nieta. She's another artist whose work I find super rich. She works in collaboration with Ben Ash, Henrietta Hale, and slime, which is an organic substance that sits perfectly between solid and liquid as a medium for contemplation, she says, communication, communion, and composition. And they work in a collective called Dog Kennel Hill. And sometimes, the thing that's continued in this work is this theme of acceptance and this ability to embrace and include and adapt. She adapts the phrase from psychotherapy, radical acceptance, from her studies with Tibetan Buddhism and a Tibetan Buddhist teacher who practices psychotherapy called James Lowe. She adapts this expression in reading what she terms the field, and in reading messages from the field being understood in the way that I've brought it into this work as all that is in the space. So accessing, she says, embodied awareness, we will explore perceptions of internal and external landscapes by investigating the shifting compositions of self and other. And here there's this expression, ritual play. So the informal constructions drawn from these expressions, or authentic movement, in her case, that's more Henny, in her case more Tibetan Buddhism, these sort of practices, experimenting with ways of seeing and being, moving and sounding, that allow us to read and to be read by others within this field of phenomenon. So I brought this sort of idea, this very much resonates with the idea I had with how I approached the Wellspring through dance. So what are the messages from the field? What is this landscape saying? How is it speaking to us? And the unseen beings, or the seen beings, depending on whether you can see them or not, obviously, of the folklore described and featured in the portraiture by Margaux and Jake that we can see in their photographs. How do we embrace that and respond to that and communicate as them as part of this complete field? So the score for dancing with Wellsprings, I took as process the dances with Wells, the score as a kind of ritual. And in this ritual, I had 3 aspects. So the first aspect was, as I said, offering homage. So presenting, coming with an attitude of homage, presenting a votive, a shell, so like Margaux was offering honey, I was picking up shells, small white stones, things like that. And an act of meditative surrender. So homage is surrender, in this case, surrendering to what that field might offer. And then partaking, I ingested the water at every site except the extraordinarily polluted and sad site, which I couldn't even dance at. And listening for the field to speak, body and voice moving with whatever emerges. So there were 3 aspects. And taking the field as everything in the space, insofar as everything in the space is spirit and so is sacred. If everything in the space has a spirit, then everything is sacred. So if we were to listen to, say, the field here, what would that be? It's all of you. It's who else is listening? What beings that we can't see, beings that we can, beings that speak English, beings that don't, and all maybe can understand something from a movement. My point of departure then was to sense and connect with the sacredness of being and beings inhabiting and embodying these Wellspring landscapes. So this artistic research, can it transfer? I mean, one aspect of our project that we talked about is how does this transfer? How does this become a practice that is in community in a very real way? So I talked about Jo and how she brings that into, she brings performance into a kind of community gathering or event and brings people of all disparate backgrounds together, and that sort of unique quality she has. So this is Tara again, the same daughter from the previous photo, offering a votive into the well and showing, this deep, this idea of opening through this deep acceptance of multifaceted ways of being that connects with the Wellspring communities. Can that sort of same attitude or same mode of being, same way of being that has this deep acceptance of these multifaceted way of being in connecting, can it connect with things at their deepest ecological level? Can it connect with the field and its messages on that very, very deep level? So as Jake said, our thoughts aren't only our own, rather thinking is a collaborative ecological process. So through ingesting, through homage, through ingesting, through calling the spirits, through then moving in response to what was in the field, this way of thinking, this attitude was intended as this collaborative ecological process that messages from the field or absorption within the field would come. So here you can see an example of community involvement with the wells, and this is a kind of starting point as an image. This lady's a guardian, so she's a well guardian at Ffynnon Santisfraid in Ceredigion in Wales, and she's basically you can see also the cat is a sort of guardian, and in fact we visited this well with our cat, Tara and my cat, and the 2 cats didn't exactly get on, but they were part of the field of this environment. This lady was somebody who wasn't very well at this time, and something that occurred to me from this encounter was that our visiting the well and our engagement with the field of the well through visual images, etc., brought, and through the animals and through the whole ambiance, the whole field of that space, that Wellspring space, the following day, we met the same lady, and she was visiting a well that we were we'd just come back from. She'd never been there. She lived not far away, but she felt like perhaps there is, she wasn't very well. Perhaps I should take this on board. Perhaps I should go and look for some healing there myself. And so we met her en route with her friend to find this well that she'd never been to, even though it's very close to her house. So in exploring local community relationships with their lived fields, what value, I thought there's some value there in our visit, but what value in general might artistic research practices such as those we undertook have for the human communities within the lived realities and cultures of the Wellspring landscapes? And can these engender or improve or generate, where they don't exist, right relationships? So you remember Margaux and the stories of the wells and the myth, the folklore around it, where if the right relationships are not there, the wells dry up, the wells send disasters, the wells disappear. So here was an opportunity with the Leilston Village Well Project. So the Leilston Village Well Project, there was a great opportunity there with a gentleman called Phil Cope, who I met at the well of my homeland. The Leilston Village Well Project, Phil invited us to contribute. So this is a book published by the Leilston Village Well Project. It's a community council initiative, and it's aimed at the exploration and reinvention of this historic wellspring site. And this is a very old photo of the well. So they want to create a new set of reasons for this once important but now untapped asset to flourish again as a major, new old, long-term focus for community engagement and pride. That's from their blurb. And central to their objectives are the local people. So they involve 2 schools in this, one a secondary and one a primary. And they wanted to inspire the young people through. Phil led these workshops in storytelling sessions where young people devised and wrote their own tales, visits to relatively unknown wells, and then also reimagining the futures for this well, which included designs for the well. So there's Leilston in Bridgend, so it's in Bridgend County, and this is the well with the children involved. I'll put this here so you can look later, involved in the project. So they're there writing, drawing, responding to the well creatively. And their school is in the background. You can see the school up at the back. So the well is literally across the road from their school. And it was interesting, Phil said some people were quite unaware that this was actually a well, even though it was just opposite their school. It's not working at the moment, although you see it used to because there's a pump. And the idea is for the children to become able to engage with the well, and perhaps through that engagement start to feel that they too would like to be guardians. So looking back at the shape of the well, the children found this, some of them saw a dragon here. And this poem by one of the children at the primary school expresses how he saw the well as a dragon, and a dragon a spring comes from the body of the dragon. Which is in this book, which if you want to look at the book or whichever later you can. And this is their drawing for how they thought this well should look. And children were thinking that the water, once treated and purified, should come out of the mouth of the dragon. So actually, local architects were working with this project, have come up with a solution to purify the water by putting a salt-based solution down in the belly of the well, in which if you built a dragon statue coming out of the mouth, you could actually have the fresh drinkable water coming out of the mouth of the dragon. Whether it gets realised is yet to be seen. So how could we contribute to this? So you probably can't quite see that, but essentially I thought of a dance workshop, bringing in the dance aspect, because Phil's done a lot of photography, he's photographed wells all over, and the children have done drawings, artwork. The only 2 artistic elements, they were wordsmiths, the only 2 elements that were kind of missing from an artistic smorgasbord for them was perhaps dance and music. So I said, okay, let me bring the dance in. So I devised a workshop for them, and I delivered it over a day at Leilston at the school. So this was the contribution. My premise was, how do we inspire the younger generation towards this right relationship which for me, that thought that we had about right relation, very aligned with the Louston Well project. So at the school, I led the dance workshop with a warm-up, and then we had a session where some people danced, other people sat with their back to them in the space and drew, and other people, children, sat in front of them, of the ones who were drawing, and spoke what they saw. So there was movement, there were words about the movement, and then there were people drawing whose back was to the movement. So they were drawing the images that other people's voices evoked. And these sort of methodologies for creating community and for getting to this sort of space of inclusion, of acceptance, of ability to connect in a very different way through an art form you may not be familiar with, really came from the ways of being the Joe Fong projects. So I drew on that in this to devise this workshop. And these are some of the examples. You can see what they were drawing from. This was not drawn from looking at people dancing, this was drawn from someone speaking about people dancing. And then we took these scripts, these scores, so to speak, and we merged them with the poetry. So the poetry is published here. The children had written these poems, they chose the ones they wanted to use, they got into groups, and then they divvied up the poems between them, and some children spoke, some people danced, and they basically created 4 short pieces, and I filmed them. So this is them. Luckily you can't see me, that's good. You can see them. This is one of the groups, and they're creating their movement piece. And then once we'd finished in the studio, we took the dances, and with a spirit of offering, we brought them to the well. And these are the young ones dancing around, dancing their piece. They came group by group to the well, and Phil photographed them, and I filmed them. And then I made a film of the whole project from start to finish, edited it, and sent it back to the school as a return to the community, as an offering to the community, school community, for them to have a gift from the day of the workshop. Outcomes for the community. Phil was very happy. He created a panel about the dance workshop using his photographs, and they put it in the exhibition for the Louston Well Village Well project, which was to generate local community interest for these designs and how to shift the focus, how to honour the well and the beings that may be there, perhaps the dragon that's still lurking there under the surface, how to honour that and bring it into a new architectural design for the well, new focus on the well, and hopefully the children being guardians, well guardians. And as Phil said, if these children now doing this dance workshop, doing these workshops, become teenagers, are they going to go and vandalise this well? Don't think so. So this was, these are a couple, he did with all the aspects of the project that he did for the Louston Village Well project, he did a survey, and this was the survey he did for the dance workshop. And there were 23 participants, and I thought what was interesting is, out of the 23, only 1 had ever done any dance workshop before. 6 of the 23, or 27%, indicated at the start, in this part that says your general comments on the day, they put things like, dance is not my thing. So in actual fact, 4 of them said, don't like dance, not a big fan, I don't like dance. And 2 of them said, dance is not my thing, it's not really my thing. So 6 out of the 23, so that's 27%. However, none of those, including those children, said that to the question, what was the overall day like, none of them answered bad. So they all answered. And in fact, some of those of the students who had said, I'm not a big fan, it's not my thing, responded in the question about what do you find interesting about the workshop, put, I quote, I'm now more confident with dance, making our own dance, the dance we did at the start, the dance moves, the dancing. So we had quite a few comments about liking dancing, even though they said we don't like it, it's not our thing. And there were some lovely comments there. So that was Phil was very pleased, very successful. Then the film and the panel came to a public consultation for the future of the well. This is now, watch that space. Who knows what's going to happen there. So value to the participants on a personal level, there was some value there in shifting perceptions, as Jake was saying about how art can shift perceptions. You could see things in a way you didn't before. Some people connecting with movement in a way they hadn't before. And one particular boy who had never really joined in with any of those kind of things, the headmaster said afterwards, that boy never joins in with those sorts of things, very retreated into himself, went up the back and he started doing this. And I went and spoke with him and he said, my eyes are hurting, my eyes are hurting, my eyes are hurting. And I said, well, why don't you come and sit by the side of the others of your group that are making something? And let's see, if your eyes stop hurting, you can join in. And if your eyes don't stop hurting, then, you can just be there and breathe. So we did some breathing together and he was covering his eyes and I covered mine. And I spoke to the other children and said, if he feels like joining in, he'd really like to be part of the group, but, it's up to you if you feel like... And they, oh, yes, we'll make something for it. And then he joined in and he ended up making a poem on the spot. And the last line of his poem really touched me because the last line of his poem was, my eyes are blind, but I can see wonder. So that was definitely some value for that one person at least. Research outcomes, flowing the flow forward. So I outlined the movement research I conducted at Wellsprings. I've offered some perspectives on what roles such artistic practice can play for communities in exploring lived ecologies, and I've discussed the potential value and importance of engagement through the arts for human reflections, connections and dances with Wellsprings. So in finishing, essentially, I'd like to quote a line from a poem of Phil Cope's, from Tinton Farm, Llangennor, which is the birthplace of Richard Price. And he says, in the line of the poem, he says, what did this green land teach you? As a question to Richard Price. So this resonates with, as Margaux was saying, what are the wells teaching me? That was me. What is this green land? What are these lands teaching me? This was essentially my quest. Somewhere in between portraiture, protest and prayer, to discover through a deep acceptance that opens to the treasures, the messages from the Wellspring fields and their spirited agencies. What can we learn from these lands, these waters? Through creating the right relationship with them, by means of a dance practice based off a score of homage, offering, partaking and listening in deep acceptance, my research in embracing the above, below and all of the Wellspring field sites hopes to hear and dance with and for their communities. So it's another watch this space as to how that might develop in the future. So our collective conclusion, this is the last part, sorry it's running over a bit. To summarise this presentation on behalf of all three of us, this is our conclusion we've written collectively. We aim to share some of our ongoing research in Wellsprings and sites of continual cultural, social, spiritual and ecological significance. As catalyst for the research, Margaux's work, As Above, So Below, created a foundation from which to consider the personhood of Wellsprings and how folklore frames them. It painted a picture of a sacred ecology in which the storied consequences of human relationships with Wellsprings are revealed. By diving into Wellspring folklore and troubling the boundaries of traditional portraiture, it explored how we might cultivate and enact our relationships with sacred Wellsprings, employing a ritual approach to fieldwork to divine right relationships with and for these sacred spaces and their lived cosmologies. Stepping through the portal, Margaux's ritual enactment opened at each website, at each well site. Jake's fieldwork delved into ecologies of the unseen through visual research considering how we enact ritual and communion with sacred waters. His work demonstrates that through active engagement and even ingestion with these sacred spaces, we access new ways of thinking, seeing and relating. With a similar ritual process, my approach to the Wellspring sites, my research explored the possibilities of communion with deep ecologies of these fields through the language of dance, emergent from an attitude of deep acceptance in dancing the field. Following through the flow of Margaux and Jake's explorations of right relationship, engendered through ritual process and the active engagement in artistic practice, as opening access to a deeper sense of lived ecologies, my work sought and seeks ways to bring these findings into active engagement with and for community, through contributing to the Leilston Village Well project, But this project and its outcomes so far highlight the value of artistic practices in evolving right relationships with sacred spaces. In lending us insights into their deeper ecologies, such practices offer us the potential to regenerate our sense of personhood as dancing within the matrix of spirited agencies that constitute the embodied landscapes of the Wellsprings. On behalf of all three of us, thank you very much.